professor, physician, epidemiologist. I am Dr. Sri Banerjee. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sri Banerjee, core faculty for the College of Health Sciences and Public Policy at Walden University. In this video, I wanted to go over an important concept, an important topic that I believe is important to understand in relation to if you're studying chronic disease epidemiology or any other field, and that is the idea of racism. Now, when we're trying to think of racism, there's many forms. Specifically, when we're thinking about environmental racism, this is systematically, it's systematic. It constructs inequities by conferring advantages upon one racial or ethnic group at the expense of others. So power and privilege are unevenly distributed across space and time. So, which is why when you look at a map of residential segregation, there's actually kind of a disproportionate sort of pattern there. So enabling some of these racist institutions and structures and influences environments, and they're influencing the environment that we live, work, play, and does this sound familiar? This is, of course, talking about social determinants of health. So, in other words, the authors are making the point that environmental racism should be considered one of the social determinants of health, and the facts are all there. They're all in the policies. For decades, there have been discriminatory policies and practices that constitute environmental racism, disproportionately burdening communities of color, specifically Black Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and Hispanic, sometimes called Latinx populations. So this might have been manifested through substandard housing in certain situations, but there were far higher rates if we look at some of the disparities in communities of color. You'll find that there are higher rates of infant mortality, higher rates of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, higher rates of heart disease, cancers, homicide, and HIV compared to the white counterparts. So now, going back to what we were talking about here, so these disparities exist, and when we extend that to environmental disparities, Kenneth Olden actually has a lecture highlighting some of the social, economic, and health consequences of ever increasing income inequality. So I encourage you to take a look at this paper by Kenneth Olden about this. I think there's a lot of good work to be kind of explored here, and I know this is off focus for you, so you might not see it. I focused it, but there's a lot of good literature in this area, and I think this one goes into a lot of historic areas. This individual talks about Jim Crow America, and experiencing some of it through family, and then looking at comparing some of these income inequalities, which are greater than many of the other countries. So this one's a good one to kind of take a look at as a link from the other one. But let's get back to the other one and kind of wrap up the main kind of the main information that was on there. So the when talking about environmental health studies, it's important to note this idea of redlining, of course. Places that were deemed unfit to reside in had poor housing qualities and things like that, and so definitely these areas now are shown to have lower normalized difference vegetation index, so lower vegetation, and so this drives income inequalities. Additionally, exposomes, the concept of exposomes to environmental aging biomarkers, these are really important. And so when people are subjected to stressors, constant stressors, faced through injustices like racism, then these exposomes are important to be studying. So how race is used is actually something that is important to note, and there's many misconceptions about it, but not ascribing racial differences to biological differences, that there's actually a distinction here, and also the fact that events such as natural hazards such as hurricanes or earthquakes cause infrastructural failure, and when that happens, the community has to be kind of vigilant of equally treating all individuals that have been affected by the natural disaster. Ones that are already on the fence line, basically communities that are struggling already, independent of race, if they're already struggling, then the idea is that if there's a disaster, natural disaster, anything, that will put them under a lot more, and then that will lead to lower health outcomes. So pre-planning for disaster is a part of this. And then finally talking about just that when understanding, when considering racial or ethnic differences in health or exposure risks, authors must also describe the potential role of racism in the questions under study. So how is it that racism is underpinning socioeconomic and environmental disparities that influence health? So studying it kind of is important. Segregation is another important one that I like to study, and that's why I'm telling you about it. The authors say that to use segregation as an example, the persistence of segregated communities reflects the effects of long-standing structural racism and the unequal distribution of resources that can be associated with health impacts. So definitely segregation is connected through economic status, and then of course there might be some unmeasured mechanisms that accompany segregation, but the consequences of segregation manifest in a lot of environmental factors, even like green space. So it's important to disaggregate race and ethnicity data. Cannot emphasize this fact enough when you're conducting environmental epidemiological studies or any sort of epidemiological study. In terms of how to write this, from a style perspective, they've adopted the uppercase B for black. We agree with the sentiment expressed by New York Times editors Dean Baquet and Philip Corbett when they wrote, "We believe this style best conveys elements of shared history and identity and reflects our goal to be respectful of all the people and communities we cover." And that, as editor Mark Lacey further stated, it is the difference between a color and a culture. So we encourage authors to use black and white, but while sometimes African American might be the appropriate term. So this is about the extent of what was covered in this article, but very important to understand that that racism is something that exists within society, and then B, how this affects chronic diseases and should be considered one of the social determinants of health. Thank you for listening.